This is the Bizgnus podcast, one-on-one conversations with experts in business and personal development.
When business finally emerges from the COVID pandemic, it'll need leaders who recognize corporate cultures that are entangling the organization. Our guest is David White, a cognitive anthropologist focusing on ways to change corporate cultures based on the emerging science of the cultural mind. He's also co-founder of Berkeley-based Ontos Global. David, welcome. Your company is based on what you call the science of culture. Obviously, I don't think we're talking about making yogurt. So what is the science of culture, and why should business leaders care, especially these days?
Well, thank you for having me. And yes, the specifically what we talk about in our company, Ontos Global, is the emerging science of the cultural mind, which sounds like a mouthful, but basically why anyone should care in business is because most of what we know about organizational culture in organizations, not the yogurt, but the stuff that seems to pervade organizations is most of what we know about culture in organizations is based on myth and urban legend. And especially as your business grows and acquires more people and more complexity, getting smart about culture becomes quite important.
Well, can you give us a couple of examples to illustrate that?
Sure, and let me just preface by saying I'm a small business owner myself. Ontos Global is a small boutique consulting firm that my partner Lisa Koss and I founded 10 years ago in the East Bay in Berkeley, California. And we're about 20 people worldwide, give or take, depending on any given project. And we are so we know some of these challenges as your business grows. This idea that culture starts at the top. That starts with the leader somehow magically transmitting her own values to the organization is really mythology. It might work in a company of 2 people or 3 people or maybe 5 or 10, but somehow there's a magic number, or I don't know exactly what it is, but at a certain point in the scale of evolution of your business, that becomes very difficult to transmit your values and your belief systems to others. Just if you have kids, just getting your kids to have your values is not that easy. And I think I rest my case when I say it's certainly not easier for a business owner.
So there goes the annual Christmas message from the top boss, I guess.
Well, I think Christmas messages are great. This doesn't absolve the boss of having a strategy or caring about their employees or doing the right thing for their communities. It just means that the company is not going to become a reflection of your personality.
Is this a matter of bad communication, that it just isn't filtering down to the guys on the front lines, or what?
No, good question. It's actually not a matter of communication. The best communication in the world will not ensure the culture. And I have now many CEOs who are master communicators, and their companies are not reflections of their communication at all in any way, shape, or form. What we know from the science of the cultural mind, which is a complex way of basically saying culture comes from the mind. Culture is a phenomenon in the brain, and it has a lot to do with how groups think. And if you think about culture from the modern science perspective, culture is what we think of as background knowledge. It's what we call a reference system. It's a way of making sense of the world around you. And to the extent that you and I and others share that background knowledge, that becomes culture for our group or community or organization. And if you think about what goes into that knowledge, a lot of it is tacit knowledge or implicit. We know it, but don't know we know it. The example I always use is the simplest example of all, but back before the days of social distancing, when we rode in elevators, how do you know when you're riding in an elevator not to look at someone in the eye? How do you know that? You probably didn't grow up being told that, right? You just know sort of normatively or socially what to do in a given situation. How do you know when you're in a business meeting, whether to give your business card to someone, as you do in some cultures before beginning a meeting, or not, or to open up your computer laptop and stare at your computer screen in the middle of the meeting, or now these days on Zoom, do you have your video on and off? How do you know these things? Well, often these are not explicit pieces of information that are handed down to you. They are known in the system, in the social system, or in the culture. So culture operates as a kind of background knowledge, a background operating system, just like your Mac or Android or Windows operating system runs in the back of your computer. You pretty much aren't aware of it until something goes wrong. And that's how culture works, right? And the analogy there is, you go to a foreign city or a foreign country, land at the airport, and realize all the signs are in a language that you don't recognize. And how do you get a taxi? How do you get to the hotel, or how do you move to, the next part of your journey? So that's how culture works. It's background knowledge, and creating that knowledge or instilling that knowledge is not a matter of communication. It's a matter of practice. We can get into that in a second if you're interested.
Yes, indeed. And give us an example of good practice, and perhaps an example that you've run across of you might call bad practice.
Well, practice in the sense, the way I use the word practice is in the sense of habits or routines, or ways of doing things formally or informally in an organization. So a practice would be very basic, your basic business practices, the way you budget, the way you hire, the way you plan, the way you allocate resources, the way you engage with customers. How do you engage with customers? How do you think about the customer, right? The way you develop products, the way you go to market, your operations, right? I mean, all of this. Now, these are problems often for bigger businesses than perhaps some of your listeners, but they all, as a business grows, these practices, these habits and routines that you instill, because there's lots of choices in how you can set up those practices. They're not all cookie cutter, very much become the carriers of your culture. And of course, leaders do have do shape those. The leaders set agendas and establish what those practices might be to begin with. So leaders do obviously play a role in culture formation, a very significant role. But it's not through communication; it's through the habits and routines that are inculcated in the business. That's what shapes the synaptic plasticity of the brain. That's how cultures are shaped and changed. If that makes sense.
It makes sense, but in these days of everybody on Zoom, everybody socially separated, nobody going to meetings anymore, the idea of hopping on a plane and flying to Pittsburgh or someplace like that is out of the question these days. How important is it for business success?
With respect to the culture, or what
Right, exactly. When you're called in, and what do you do when you're called into a company these days?
Well, we find in this time of pandemics and Zoom and whatnot is that business cultures organizational cultures are more in force than ever. Another way of thinking about that is the tendencies that you have as a business get magnified under times of stress, in the same way that our tendencies as humans individually get magnified in times of stress. So, for example, businesses that are by practice, by culture, very risk averse in these times of COVID, well, guess what? Have become more risk averse, more intolerant of any kind of risk whatsoever. We have a company, a client that's in the defense business. They're a contractor to large defense companies like Raytheon and Boeing, and they, in this time, they have become so security conscious of the safety and security of their own employees that they have banned all travel and gone to great lengths on their factories and their factory floors to ensure the safety of their employees. So this is sort of another manifestation of their sort of defense mentality or security mentality, a better way of saying it, that has been sort of extended to all practices in their company. So these sort of what we call dominant logics that are at the core of your business, sort of the logic by which you run your business tends to pervade all these other parts of your business habitually. And now you can change that if you become aware of it and sort of are aware that maybe, I don't want to be so security conscious in all parts of the business. I want to be able to be more choiceful in how I do that. But that takes a fair amount of awareness and a fair amount of leadership fortitude to change that.
David, you have written a book about this, which has a very interesting title. It's almost unsettling when you read the title of the book. Tell our listeners and viewers what it is.
Well, the book is a lot of what we're talking about right here. It's called Disrupting Corporate Culture. And it's basically about how cognitive science, the science of the mind, the amazing findings in neuroscience over the last 20 to 30 years have really changed the way anthropologists, I'm an anthropologist by training, like myself, think about culture and why business leaders should care. And a lot of it has to do with these myths, as we talked about. And a lot of it comes down to organizational change. When you're trying to change or transform or grow your organization significantly or change it from fundamentally from one thing to another, this is where culture really rises up to usually conspire against you, because it's hard to change a company that's been making widgets. The classic example that I use all the time, what we see a lot, is manufacturing companies these days are confronted by this massive digital revolution where data and information is becoming the stock in trade more than the actual parts or pumps or bolts or widgets that you're selling. And so how do companies, 100-year-old manufacturing companies of scales and measurement systems, or, industrial automation or industrial parts, how does a company like that transform itself into a digital company? Not so easy. And the reason it's not easy is because when you are in industrial, you think in certain particular habitual ways. And when you're a software business or a data business, you think in other foundational habitual ways. And those are very, very different ways of thinking, very different mindsets. And that's the cultural impact that we're talking about. As in the business, as we say, industrials have a hard time shipping beta versions of refrigerators. Software companies ship software with known bugs all the time. Why? Because in 2 weeks from now, you'll get another release that will correct the problems with this one. GE can't afford to do that, or Siemens can't afford to do that, right? If your refrigerator doesn't work, it's a big problem. So these are non-trivial examples because they show the depth to which culture operates and how closely culture relates to the tasks. Culture comes from what you do all day long. So you want to change culture, you have to change what you're doing all day long, basically.
David, tell our audience how you got started in this business. You're an anthropologist, so we understand the academic side of that, but what brought you into running a small business?
A long circuitous journey full of accidents, mostly. My career has been in large organizations as well as entrepreneurial startups. I've been in human resources and organizational development and leadership development for 30 years. And both working inside large companies like IBM and Microsoft, mostly in the tech world, but also running my own, I for a few years developed my own software company, which I sold to a larger company. So I've also been in HR for very small startups, mostly in the tech sector. But so I got interested in the questions of culture because I never saw culture being dealt with in large companies in ways that I felt was particularly successful. A lot of money, a lot of talent, a lot of great ideas and strong leaders concerned about culture and their own culture and changing culture and developing their culture. But I never saw any of those initiatives really work or amount to anything, because what the leaders would talk about or what the fancy posters on the walls would say was not really the lived experience of the people in the organization. And I got curious about why that is. And that led me back to school. at the tender age of 48 to figure this question out, and that led to a PhD and a couple of books, and that's how I got to where I am. So basically, a lot of curiosity and a lot of failure.
Well, that's a success. That's a success story when you have enough failures to make a success out of it.
Well, I don't know if it's a success, but it's a work in progress.
It's like Edison, I guess. Now,
Yeah.
so many of our listeners and viewers are middle management. A lot of them are in HR. If they feel that their organization's culture needs some sort of kick in the behind, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, I would say as a fellow HR professional, I would say the biggest thing that you can do is again focus on practices. What is it not so much what the leaders are saying or the company is saying or espousing, but what is it that you're actually doing on the ground? And when we say practices, I'll repeat myself, it's not just the people practices. We often think of culture as just something to do with the people and the people practices. It's really the core ways in which you run your business. And so if I were an HR professional in any kind of mid-sized company of any size, I would look closely at, and I wanted to change or help change the culture, I would look closely at the core ways you run your business. Like, how are you planning? How are you allocating resources? How are you setting budgets? How are you engaging with customers, et cetera? And look at those core practices and look at the ones which need to change in order to support the direction that you're trying to go in. And I'll make sure there's alignment therein. Some of those practices are people oriented, of course, like how you hire, how you develop, how you promote. Those are all very important as well as our certain social practices, like how you handle conflict or differences of opinion in the organization. What are the norms around that? Those are all part of this set of practices that you would want to look at and decide which ones are the most important ones to change.
When you go into a company and you realize it needs your assistance, how do you go about effecting those changes? Are you looking for new training classes for the employees, a brochure, a pep talk from the big guy? What might it be?
Yeah, usually those things are not sufficient to really have much of an impact, as you probably know. A lot of it has to do with bringing a leadership team, the CEO and his or her top managers, into awareness about how culture really works, and making tough choices about given their desired direction or the desired change that they want to enact, because presumably you're there to begin with because there's a problem and there's a change that they want to see. So it's usually a factor of bringing awareness of these practices and the sort of underlying logics that hold these practices in place, that make them seem rational and reasonable, but are conspiring against the change you're trying to make. And so once you bring a leadership team make a leadership team aware of these phenomena, that this is going on, then it's a matter of really figuring out, okay, where are the high leverage practices that we want to change, which is the biggest bang for the buck here, which 2 or 3, because usually an organization is not going to change everything that they do all at once. That's very destabilizing, but certainly there are high leverage practices that you can focus on. Often it's around core ways in which you run your business. One of our clients, for example, one of the biggest areas of impact is changing their management reporting practices, the way they keep tabs on what the business is doing. So instead of spending 30 hours a month monitoring business performance by going through all these business reviews, they cut that back to 10 hours a month. That's a huge change to the organization. And you want to change culture, just think about how many hours you spend in management meetings reviewing the performance of the business. And could you have that or reduce that by, 50 to 60 to 70%, and what that would do to the culture of your business? That's the kind of stuff we're talking about here.
And if you could just eliminate one meeting a week, you'd be a hero for a lot of people.
Exactly. And it has a profound ripple effect, because it's not just the hours, it's what it actually means about empowering, for example, your middle managers to do more, et cetera. But that's the secret of culture change, resides in things like that. not so much in the pronouncements of the CEO or the pretty posters or the memo or the rah-rah town hall speech or whatever it is they might be doing.
It's been a long time since I've seen an ad for those posters. I think it's been last time I flew, come to think of it, and looked at a flight magazine.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, exactly.
Now, you've been, our listeners and viewers would probably like to know, how do they get hold of you? Do you have a website or something like that?
Our firm is Ontos Global. That's a O-N, Nancy, like Nancy, T-O-S, global, like the world.com. Again, we're based in Berkeley, California. And yeah, that's how you find me and us and my associates. And we basically focus on helping companies change, and culture, as well as leadership development and talent management are our areas of focus.
You've been very generous with your thoughts and ideas, but what would you like to add that I haven't been bright enough to ask you?
Oh, your questions are great. I would say, culture change of an organization of any size is obviously not for the faint of heart. It's a lot. There wouldn't be so many books and consultants out there in the world like me talking about it if it was easy. Culture change in particular is difficult because as soon as it's a thing in the mind, and because it's a social phenomena, as soon as you bring it to the light of day, it's liable to be changed, right? Because it's not sort of a thing that you can see or touch. How do you touch the culture? Where is the culture, right? It's more like picking up water in your hand. As soon as you have it, it's gone, right? So it's what I would say in closing is that it takes a lot of commitment from a leader or leadership team to carry through the kinds of things I'm talking about. And that is particularly why changing cultures in organizations is so hard, because very few leaders have the time, energy, intestinal fortitude, stamina to go through the kind of stuff we're talking about here. And so there usually has to be a very, very important fundamental reason why you feel your organization needs to change, like, digital transformation, right? Your company is going to be obsolete in 5 years unless you make these changes, that kind of thing. That's when culture change tends to be most successful.
You've been watching the Bizgnus podcast. We welcome your input. Send your email to editor@bizgnus.com. Thanks for watching.